Dovi, will you come and speak? The last one we have asked to come and speak at this panel is attorney Mr. Dov Weissglas, who was the former advisor and bureau chief of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. He was his advisor for special issues. He's a very well-known attorney. And I'm asking you, Dovi, to try and respond to the proposals that have come up here, because the blocks and the gaps are the starting point of all of us. Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you. I would like to thank Rob for his warm words. Udi said that he knows Hebrew, but when I have to speak about decent diplomacy, I talk about my first visit to the White House. And the head of protocols lined up all the distinguished people of the National Security Council. It was Condoleezza Rice and her deputies, and Rob was among them. And we came and we were introduced to them and we shook hands. And when we went past him, he whispered to me in his American accent, "Tell my people to beware because I understand every single word." Isn't that what you said? Yes, you see, he understands every single word. I just put him on the spot now. Shlomo, I have two comments. First, about this whole sequence, issue of sequence. When we talked about the present here, you also looked at the history. Somebody once said about the history about Israel that it's the past that changes, the future is known. In the past 12 years, the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians have been measured in two time frames, between 2000 and 2006 and from 2006 to today. Between 2000 and 2006 or 2005, maybe the focal point was the day that Arafat passed away, we had a corrupt Palestinian Authority that had terrorists in it, and there were no mechanisms against terrorism. All its capacity, all its ability was to obtain and to try and achieve cooperation just did not exist. And if people remember those days, it wasn't just a matter of Israeli security, it was just as well also the question of Palestinian security. I remember we used to buy videotapes of people, of Palestinian peddlers who sold videos of executions, and we saw someone on one of the tapes who was 80 years old, and he was dragged on the ground with his hands tied back, and he was being shot, and then they poured oil on him and they set fire to him. And when we asked the photographer who was that, he said that was a collaborator. And we said, if that's a collaborator, that person looks 80, he looks elderly. And when we said to the photographer, if we don't hear the truth, we won't pay you 200 shekels. Then he said, truth be told, he's a pedophile. So apparently he was an old man who used to pick on other people's children. And he said that the price then for an execution of a person who sinned, such as him, was between 200 and 300 shekels. A very famous clan, a very famous mob was working then, and with that price then there was no reason to talk about any settlement, any arrangement, any peace accord. Everything was just a farce. And at the time, all we could remember in the discussions and in the meetings, that when the military secretary came in, by the pale face he had, we knew that we were hit and struck again. And if I have to say in a closed comment, we have security people here who know that with our technology and with all our powers and all our satellites, we stood helpless in front of one of those villagers who just went up onto a bus in Tel Aviv and 30 people were killed. So in the negotiation vis-à-vis the Americans, we made security the precondition to everything. And President Bush on June 24th, 2002 actually accepted the axiom that our government set, that we first of all need order. We need order in the government of the Palestinians. We need intelligence. We need a chain of prevention, and only then a beginning of a political peace process. And from that speech, these the things went up to the roadmap, and there was an Israeli resolution, and was then the UN resolution, and was part of a national judgment. But the Palestinians actually did the first part of the roadmap almost to a T. And I was asked whether Sharon really believed that after the first section of the roadmap will end, negotiations will begin, or did he understand that the first section of the roadmap is one of the hurdles that the Palestinians will never be able to overcome? And I don't know. I have to say the truth. I don't know if he thought that now he is putting an obstacle in their path, or he thought that he will overcome this obstacle and it will be so good that we will be able to initiate a peace process. And the unbelievable happened. The Palestinians actually fulfilled their first part of the roadmap. But the internal security is impressive. The cooperation with IDF is impressive. Their economics has really improved greatly. They have law, they have order, they fight crime, they fight corruption. If they had 36% they didn't have people working, 30% didn't work, then now it's only 9%. And the main thing is that our lives between the beginning of 2000, when the Intifada began, until 2006, we had 1,188 terrorist victims, and most of them was by terrorists coming from the West Bank. Very few were hurt in Gaza. And since 2006, I think we maybe had 6 or 7. You can't even compare. And when they fulfilled their role, when they completed their task, and in our eyes and in Sharon's eyes, that was the most important part, we sort of disappeared. We disappeared. And if our concern, our fear to enter real thorough negotiations with the Palestinians was Sharon's nightmare, that we are going to have a sovereign Palestinian state that is independent, who is based on the negligence and those security mechanisms and that were more engaged in terrorism than security, any entrance of the IDF into these territories is no longer policing action. It is infiltration, invasion of their rights. And then he went back to the 1950s and he said, if this negligence continues, then we will not be able to go back to the negotiation table. But the negligence has finished, and now this precondition has been met, and we have in certain respects disappeared. Another comment to my friend, a good friend Ziad Abu Zayad, about the disengagement. The times have moved a little bit. We disengaged from Gaza because we saw Arafat as the responsible one for the terrorism, and by the way, we suspected that during Operation Defense Shield, we had we raided the Muqatta'a, and we found so many documents there that were signed by Arafat, where he confirmed, where he approved the cost of the people who helped the terrorists into Israel, and he also had remarks, he's asking for too much money and so forth. And to my assessment, much of this material was passed to Mr. Robert Denin and his friends, and this material was the critical mass, the cumulative critical mass that made Arafat in the vis-a-vis the American administration from a solution to the biggest problem. And in 2002, in June 2002, when President Bush spoke about and transformed the political spectrum, and he said that the Palestinians deserve a better leadership. We didn't see Arafat as a partner, and that is why we did not give him as he coordinated with the forces on the ground in terms of security. And what happened afterwards, I'm sorry, my dear friend, regardless of the disengagement, in 2007, almost 2 years after the disengagement, Hamas took over by force the Gaza Strip, took thousands of security personnel, and they all fled, and that is why things have changed. It has nothing to do with us. So the fault, or it's not really a fault, but the problem with the sequence, Shlomo, is that very elegantly and very simply we are ignoring not only the commitments, but the fundamental basics of the agreement from 2000 to 2006, and we actually went backwards to the first starting point. And if I were a Palestinian, and I hope Zayad also felt that way, if I were Palestinian, I would say to myself, Ehud Barak, in September 2000, offered the Palestinians a peace plan that is based on, we all know, withdrawal almost to the 1967 borders, with to divide up Jerusalem, and some symbolic solutions for the refugee problem. And these things have been done already at the beginning of the Intifada. And in our discourse with the Americans, when Sharon wrote the letter to Bush, of course it was vis-à-vis the Americans, not the Palestinians, but we actually went back and we reiterated the same principles, so that in his letter, the President Bush speaks of Israel not withdrawing the 1967 lines, but about the demographic changes on the ground. Again, the reference is to the big areas, maybe 6 or 7%, and the rest of the 94% will be Palestinian in the West Bank. So when we came back from the United States from that very impressive event of the letter, then Mr. Ariel Sharon, former Prime Minister, said to me on the way, look, Rabin was assassinated because he dared to withdraw from one neighborhood in Hebron. And we are now coming back with we have fame after we have left 95% of the area to the Palestinians. That was what happened. The territorial meaning of the President's letter was that 5% of the West Bank, which is the major areas, will be Israeli, but not because everything else is still hanging in the air. 95% will be Palestinian. And needless to say that Ehud Barak's peace plan, that pretty much based on the same parameters, was proposed and offered, and there's a dispute whether it has been rejected or why they stopped talking about it because of Operation Cast Lead. Either way, they're saying that in the height of terrorism we got a certain peace plan, and now that we have stopped being terrorists, and now when the security situation between Palestinians and Israelis has never been better, and majorly attributed to the Palestinian contribution, now you think that we're going to get less, that we're going to make bigger concessions, that we should be punished for 6 years of calm and quiet, almost entirely? That just makes no sense. And because this makes no sense, there will be no negotiation. Because you can't turn the wheel back, turn time back. We can't take our words back. And what has been proposed and offered in the most terrible of times, in terms of the relationship between the parties, has now been taken back. And one thing, while they have proved one thing in the meantime, and this meantime has been for the last 6 years, that they can definitely control and enforce the law, and to prevent terrorism, and to prevent groups from uprising. And one of my friends, who's an officer in the Central Command, on the day that Abu Mazen was supposed to speak at the UN, he was just telling me that there is some sort of tension on the Palestinian street. They have 9,000 police officers, absolutely everywhere, in every corner, in cooperation, complete cooperation with some sort of command room or something with the IDF, with the central command. And the problems that were here in Jaffa and in Wadi Ara and in al-Fahim, the mess here in our cities was much bigger on that day than there was in the Palestinian territories, because of those policemen who are standing around with bags of sandwiches they brought from home because they weren't paid for 3 weeks, because our Minister of Finance didn't give them their money. So why will nothing happen? Why will there be no negotiations? It has nothing to do with the plans. It has to do with the political reality in Israel. Since the Likud party is heading the country, and because of processes that I cannot go into right now, the democratization is not being carried out properly, and the central weight is being moved from the parties to the center parties and back to the voters, and the voters are people who are paying for 30 shekel and then are just registered as people who are part of the party, but they're not necessarily voting for that party. And I don't want to go into figures and numbers, I want to be precise, but these are people who have come from the settlements. They have registered up as Likud party members because they know that's where the strength is. And Mr. Netanyahu, in the last convention, who was supposed to be accepted and greeted as a victor, he heard the same curses that Sharon heard on May 16th, 2002, when Netanyahu assembled the Likud leaders and said that he will not accept a Palestinian state. And the same people who cursed Sharon then cursed Netanyahu now, and those who sang Bibi, King of Israel then, are the same ones who cursed him today. And now the control of the settlers in the mechanisms of the parties, especially the Likud, is as such that there will be no bilateral or unilateral move or anything of the sort, because you have to decide, because Netanyahu has to decide whether he can exist politically or whether he is splitting up the Likud, and not in the Knesset. It has nothing to do with the Knesset, it has nothing to do with the faction, it has to do with almost 90,000 people who are registered as members of the Knesset, of the Likud party, and that is why he will not be able, he has not been able to evacuate an illegal outpost, so now he will not be able to do more than that. And as long as Israel is moderate in the current political situation where the settlers are in control and they are controlling this body of the Likud members, then this stagnation will continue, the stalemate will continue, and another political venture. We don't have a majority and minority. If we have 30% settlers, it's not because there's 70% opposing them. This 30% are absolute, because everyone who is against them is just groups that do not have a common denominator. There's 30% and there's another other groups that the sum thereof is zero. So if we're looking at this as an experiment in a lab, then practically there will be nothing. Thank you. We can all relax.